Part 1. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou when President Ibrahim Traore received the call that would change everything. It was his foreign minister, calling from the United Nations General Assembly in New York, his voice barely containing his excitement. "Mr. President, you need to see what just happened in the General Assembly Hall. The African Union has just announced something unprecedented." Traore set down the agricultural reports he had been reviewing and gave his full attention to the call. "What kind of announcement?" "A continental declaration, sir. 43 African nations have simultaneously announced their intention to withdraw from the CFA franc system, establish a new African monetary union, and create a continental resource-sharing agreement. They're calling it the African Economic Renaissance Pact." The magnitude of what he was hearing began to sink in. This wasn't just another regional cooperation agreement or diplomatic statement. This was a fundamental restructuring of Africa's relationship with the global economy. Who initiated this? Traore asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "That's the remarkable part, Mr. President. They're saying it was inspired by your policies here in Burkina Faso. Your nationalization of gold mines, your expulsion of French military bases, your introduction of free healthcare and education. Other leaders have been watching, and apparently deciding that if a small landlocked country like ours can achieve economic sovereignty, so can they." Traore walked to his office window, looking out over the capital city where the effects of his policies were already visible. New hospitals under construction, schools being expanded, infrastructure projects funded by nationalized mining revenues rather than foreign loans. "Tell me about the specific commitments," he said. His foreign minister's voice carried a note of awe. "Mr. President, this is bigger than anything we've seen since independence. Nigeria is nationalizing its oil industry and expelling all foreign military bases. Kenya is taking control of its ports from European management companies. Ghana is reclaiming its gold mines from multinational corporations. The Democratic Republic of Congo is nationalizing its cobalt and lithium operations." The list continued, each announcement more significant than the last. South Africa was withdrawing from international mining agreements that favored European companies. Ethiopia was canceling its debt obligations to Western creditors and offering to pay only what it calculated as the principal without compound interest. Tanzania was seizing control of its agricultural exports from foreign commodity traders. "But that's not all," his foreign minister continued. "They've established a new Continental Development Fund, capitalized entirely by African resources and African labor. No foreign loans, no structural adjustment programs, no conditions imposed by international financial institutions." Traore sat down slowly, absorbing the implications of what he was hearing. For decades, African leaders had talked about continental unity, economic integration, and independence from former colonial powers. But it had always remained largely theoretical, hampered by individual nations' dependence on existing international systems. "What's the international reaction?" he asked. "Chaos, Mr. President. Complete chaos. The French president has called an emergency cabinet meeting. The European Union is threatening economic sanctions. The World Bank is claiming this violates international law. The International Monetary Fund is saying it will destabilize the global economy. And the American response?" Secretary of State Blinken issued a statement calling it reckless nationalism that threatens regional stability. But privately, we're hearing that the Biden administration is more concerned about Chinese and Russian influence than they are about African independence. Traore began to smile. The Western reaction was entirely predictable. For generations, African attempts at economic independence had been met with threats, sanctions, and in some cases military intervention. But this was different. This wasn't one small country that could be isolated and punished. This was nearly the entire continent moving simultaneously. "Mr. President," his foreign minister continued, "there's something else. The African Union has formally invited you to address the General Assembly tomorrow. They want you to explain the Burkina Faso model to the international community. They're calling you the architect of African Renaissance." The irony wasn't lost on Traore. 2 years ago, Western media had dismissed him as just another military coup leader, an inexperienced young man who didn't understand the complexities of international relations. Now those same complexities were being turned on their head by leaders across the continent who had decided that the Burkinabe approach might be worth replicating. "What time is my flight?" he asked. Within hours, Traore was en route to New York, but the story was already spreading across global media. CNN was calling it Africa's Brexit moment. The BBC described it as the most significant challenge to the post-colonial economic order since independence. Al Jazeera termed it the dawn of true African sovereignty. But the most telling reactions were coming from African social media. Across the continent, young people were celebrating in the streets. University students in Lagos were carrying signs reading, "Finally, leaders with courage." Market women in Accra were singing traditional songs of liberation. Miners in Johannesburg were chanting Traore's name, recognizing that the policies he had implemented in Burkina Faso were now spreading across their continent. The hashtag African Renaissance was trending globally, with millions of Africans sharing their hopes for a future where their continent's vast resources would serve African development rather than foreign enrichment. As Traore's plane crossed the Atlantic, he reviewed the speech he would deliver to the United Nations. But he already knew that the real audience wasn't the diplomats in New York. It was the billion Africans who were finally beginning to believe that a different future was possible. The flight gave him time to reflect on how rapidly things had changed. When he first came to power through a military coup in 2022, international observers had predicted that Burkina Faso would descend into chaos without French military support and European economic partnerships. Instead, the opposite had happened. By nationalizing the gold mines and renegotiating mining contracts to give Burkina Faso 60% of profits instead of 5%, government revenues had increased by 400%. That money had immediately been invested in healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Free medical care and free education had been introduced within 6 months. The expulsion of French military bases had initially caused concern about security, but Traore had replaced them with a community-based defense system that was proving more effective against local threats than foreign military interventions had ever been. Most importantly, the psychological impact of these changes had been profound. Burkinabe citizens had begun to see their government as serving their interests rather than foreign corporate profits. That shift in perception was now spreading across Africa. As the plane approached New York, Traore could see the city skyline in the distance. Tomorrow, he would stand before the United Nations General Assembly and explain why nearly an entire continent had decided to chart a new course. But tonight, he knew that the real work was just beginning. The African rebirth wasn't just about economics or politics. It was about dignity. It was about the simple revolutionary idea that African resources should serve African people, that African governments should answer to African citizens, and that African leaders should prioritize African interests. For too long, Africa had been told that such ideas were naive, unrealistic, or dangerous. Tomorrow, Ibrahim Traore would explain to the world why a continent had decided that the truly dangerous path was continuing to accept exploitation as inevitable. The young president from Burkina Faso was about to address the United Nations as the voice of a continental awakening that no amount of international pressure could reverse. Africa was returning to itself, and the world would never be the same. But the story of this continental awakening had deeper roots than most international observers understood. For months before the public announcement, African leaders had been conducting secret meetings, sharing intelligence about their country's resource extraction agreements, and coordinating their responses to Western economic pressure. The catalyst had indeed been Burkina Faso's success. When Traore nationalized the gold mines in 2023, international financial institutions had predicted economic collapse. Instead, government revenues had quadrupled, allowing massive investments in social programs that Western aid agencies had spent decades trying to implement with limited success. Other African leaders had taken notice. President Félix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo had quietly sent a delegation to Ouagadougou to study Burkina Faso's nationalization process. Nigeria's president had requested detailed briefings on how to transition from foreign military partnerships to indigenous security systems. South Africa's leadership had sought advice on renegotiating mining contracts with multinational corporations. The momentum had built slowly, then accelerated rapidly. By early 2024, informal networks of African finance ministers, central bankers, and economic advisors were meeting regularly to discuss alternatives to the existing international financial system. The CFA franc, which allowed France to control the monetary policy of 14 African nations, became a particular focus of these discussions. The breakthrough had come when Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, announced it was prepared to anchor a new continental currency backed by African oil, gold, and agricultural reserves rather than European central banks. With Nigeria's commitment secured, other nations began falling into line rapidly. The technical aspects of the African Economic Renaissance Pact were unprecedented in their scope and ambition. The new monetary system would be based on a basket of African commodities and managed by a continental central bank headquartered in Cairo. Trade between African nations would be conducted in the new currency, reducing dependence on the dollar and euro. More importantly, the pact included unprecedented resource-sharing agreements. Nigeria's oil wealth would help finance infrastructure projects across the continent. South Africa's industrial capacity would be made available for continental development. The Democratic Republic of Congo's mineral wealth would be extracted and processed through partnerships with other African nations rather than European corporations. The social media reaction had been immediate and overwhelming. Young Africans who had grown up watching their continent's wealth flow to foreign shareholders were celebrating what many were calling the beginning of true independence. University students from Cairo to Cape Town were organizing solidarity demonstrations. Diaspora communities in London, Paris, and New York were planning massive support rallies. But perhaps most significantly, the announcement had triggered a wave of economic nationalism across Africa that was proving impossible to contain. Even countries that hadn't officially joined the pact were beginning to renegotiate their relationships with foreign corporations and international financial institutions. As Traore's plane prepared for landing at JFK Airport, he knew that tomorrow's speech at the United Nations would be about much more than explaining Burkina Faso's policies. He would be articulating a vision of African development that challenged fundamental assumptions about how the global economy should work. The Western response had been swift and predictable. European stock markets had dropped sharply as investors realized that some of their most profitable extractive industries were about to be nationalized. Mining companies with operations across Africa had seen their share prices collapse. Currency traders were scrambling to understand the implications of a potential new reserve currency backed by African resources. But Traore understood that the real significance of what was happening couldn't be measured in stock prices or currency fluctuations. For the first time since the colonial era ended, Africa was asserting collective control over its own destiny. The psychological impact of that assertion, wow! The United Nations General Assembly Hall had never seen anything quite like it. As President Ibrahim Traore approached the podium, representatives from 43 African nations rose to their feet in unprecedented solidarity. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, while delegates from European and North American countries sat in uncomfortable silence. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres looked visibly nervous as he introduced the young Burkinabe president. The UN had seen many historic speeches, but rarely had a single address carried the potential to fundamentally reshape the global economic order. Distinguished delegates, fellow leaders, citizens of the world, Traore began, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority that commanded immediate attention. I stand before you today not just as the president of Burkina Faso, but as the voice of a continent that has finally decided to return to itself. The hall was completely silent, every delegate understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented. For too long, Africa has been described by others rather than defining itself. We have been called the developing world, the third world, the global south, always in relation to somewhere else, always as something incomplete, always as something that needs to be fixed by external intervention. Traore stepped away from the podium slightly, his movement adding emphasis to his words. But today, I want to tell you who we really are. We are the continent that feeds the world while our children go hungry. We are the continent that powers your industries while our people live without electricity. We are the continent that enriches your banks while our governments borrow money to fund basic services. The African delegates were nodding, clearly moved by words that articulated what many had felt for generations. We are the continent that produces 60% of the world's diamonds while our people cannot afford clean water. We are the continent that extracts 30% of global uranium while our hospitals lack basic medical equipment. We are the continent that grows the cocoa for your chocolate while our farmers live in poverty. This is not development. This is not partnership. This is not cooperation. This is exploitation with a diplomatic smile. Several European delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that Traore was systematically dismantling the narratives they had used to justify African policies for decades. But I am not here today to relitigate the past, Traore continued, his tone becoming more forward-looking. I am here to announce the future. Yesterday, 43 African nations simultaneously declared our intention to fundamentally restructure our relationship with the global economy. He paused, allowing the magnitude of this announcement to register throughout the hall. We are withdrawing from monetary systems that allow former colonial powers to control our currencies. We are nationalizing industries that extract our resources while leaving our people impoverished. We are establishing trade relationships based on mutual benefit rather than historical exploitation. The reaction was immediate and electric. African delegates erupted in applause while Western representatives sat in stunned silence. This wasn't just diplomatic rhetoric, this was a declaration of economic independence from nearly an entire continent. Some of you will call this dangerous. Some will call it reckless. Some will call it a threat to international stability, Traore continued, his voice rising slightly. But let me ask you something, dangerous for whom? Reckless for whom? A threat to whose stability? The questions hung in the air, unanswered but understood by everyone in the hall. Is it dangerous for African children to have access to healthcare funded by African resources? Is it reckless for African governments to prioritize African development over foreign corporate profits? Is it a threat to stability when African nations control their own monetary policy? Traore looked directly at the section where European delegates were seated. Or is it only dangerous, reckless, and threatening when it challenges systems that have benefited everyone except Africans? The systematic deconstruction of Western economic orthodoxy was now in full swing. Let me share some statistics that might help you understand why this continental awakening was inevitable, Traore said, pulling out a folder of documents. Last year, foreign companies extracted $89 billion worth of resources from African soil. African governments received less than $15 billion in taxes, royalties, and wages combined. Where did the other $74 billion go? He answered his own question. It went to shareholders in London, Paris, New York, and Toronto. It went to executives who have never set foot on African soil. It went to investment funds that view African poverty as acceptable collateral damage for European prosperity. Several delegates were taking notes frantically, understanding that they were hearing a level of specificity rarely presented in UN addresses. But that's just the beginning. African nations currently pay $68 billion annually in debt service to Western creditors. Most of this debt was incurred by previous governments under agreements that primarily benefited foreign contractors. We are literally paying foreign banks to keep us impoverished. Traore's voice gained strength as he reached the heart of his argument. The CFA franc system allows France to control the monetary policy of 14 African nations. These countries must deposit 50% of their foreign currency reserves in the French treasury. They cannot issue currency without French approval. This is not partnership, this is monetary colonialism. The French delegation looked visibly uncomfortable as Traore continued his systematic exposure of their economic control mechanisms. Military bases operated by foreign powers on African soil cost us $12 billion annually in lost sovereignty and economic opportunity. These bases exist primarily to protect foreign mining operations and maintain political systems that serve external rather than internal interests. So when you hear about the African Economic Renaissance Pact, understand what we are really doing. We are taking control of $89 billion in annual resource extraction. We are redirecting $68 billion in debt payments toward African development. We are reclaiming $12 billion in military spending for African security priorities. The mathematical precision of Traore's argument was devastating. He wasn't making ideological points, he was presenting an economic case for African independence that was impossible to refute. That's $169 billion annually that will now serve African development instead of foreign enrichment. With that money, we can build hospitals, schools, universities, roads, telecommunications networks, and industrial facilities. We can create jobs for African youth. We can achieve food security for African families. We can provide energy for African development. The African delegates were on their feet again, understanding that they were hearing a practical blueprint for continental transformation rather than just inspirational rhetoric. But this is about more than money, Traore continued, his tone becoming more personal. This is about dignity. This is about the simple revolutionary idea that African children deserve the same opportunities as children everywhere else. This is about the radical proposition that African governments should serve African interests. He looked around the hall, making eye contact with delegates from every region. Some of you will try to stop this. Some of you will impose sanctions, threaten intervention, or attempt to isolate African nations that choose sovereignty over subordination. But understand this, we are not asking for your permission. We are not seeking your approval. We are informing you of decisions that have already been made by people who have finally decided to control their own destiny. The power of this declaration was unmistakable. This wasn't a request or a negotiation, this was a fait accompli delivered with diplomatic courtesy but absolute determination. The era of grateful acceptance of exploitative partnerships is over. The era of African leaders seeking Western validation is over. The era of treating African poverty as inevitable is over. Traore returned to the podium for his conclusion. Africa is returning to itself. We are reclaiming our resources, our currencies, our sovereignty, and our dignity. We invite the international community to engage with us as equals, to trade with us fairly, and to respect our right to determine our own future. But with or without your cooperation, the African rebirth has begun. Our children will grow up in an Africa that serves African interests. Our resources will fund African development. Our governments will answer to African citizens. He paused, scanning the hall one final time. The audacious return of a continent to itself is not a threat to the world. It is a gift to the world. Because a prosperous, sovereign, and dignified Africa will be a better partner to everyone. As Traore stepped away from the podium, the African delegations erupted in the longest-standing ovation in UN history. The young president from Burkina Faso had just delivered a speech that would be remembered as the moment Africa announced its intention to finally control its own destiny. The rebirth was no longer just an idea. It was now official UN policy for nearly an entire continent. But the immediate aftermath was equally dramatic. As the applause continued, delegates could see European and American representatives frantically typing on their phones, clearly communicating with their capitals about the crisis that had just unfolded before their eyes. The French ambassador sat rigid in his chair, his face pale as he realized that the economic relationship his country had maintained with Africa for generations had just been publicly dismantled by a 34-year-old military officer who was supposed to be a manageable regional problem. Within minutes, News networks around the world were breaking into their regular programming to cover what commentators were already calling the most significant geopolitical shift since the end of the Cold War. On CNN, the headline read, "Africa declares economic independence, 43 nations announce withdrawal from Western financial systems." The BBC's banner proclaimed, "Continental Awakening, African leaders unite behind Burkina Faso model." Al Jazeera's coverage focused on the popular reaction across Africa, showing footage of celebrations in major cities from Cairo to Cape Town. Young Africans were dancing in the streets, waving flags, and chanting Traore's name. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the financial markets. European stock exchanges were in freefall as investors realized that some of their most profitable operations were about to be nationalized. Mining companies saw their share prices drop by 40 to 60%. Currency traders were panic selling as the implications of a new African monetary system began to sink in. In London, the FTSE 100 had dropped 800 points by the time markets closed. In Paris, the CAC 40 suffered its worst single-day loss in over a decade. Even Wall Street wasn't immune, with American corporations that had extensive African operations seeing massive sell-offs. Meanwhile, social media was exploding with reactions from around the world. #African Renaissance was the top trending topic globally, with over 50 million mentions in the first 6 hours after Traore's speech. Young Africans in particular were sharing the speech with commentary that revealed years of frustration with the status quo. "Finally, someone said what we've all been thinking," wrote a university student in Nairobi. "This is what leadership looks like," posted a young entrepreneur in Lagos. But the reaction wasn't limited to Africa. Progressive activists in Europe and America were sharing clips of Traore's speech, using it to highlight the contradictions in their own government's foreign policies. "How can we claim to support democracy while maintaining systems that impoverish 1 billion people?" asked a trending post from London. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and severe. The French president called an emergency meeting of EU leaders to discuss their response to what he termed African economic terrorism. The German chancellor issued a statement warning about the dangerous precedent of countries unilaterally withdrawing from international agreements. But African leaders weren't backing down. By evening, presidents from across the continent were issuing statements of solidarity with the African Economic Renaissance Pact. Even countries that hadn't initially joined were announcing their intention to review their relationships with foreign corporations and international financial institutions. As night fell in New York, Ibrahim Traore stood on the balcony of his hotel room, looking out over the city that had just witnessed the formal announcement of Africa's return to itself. His phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from world leaders, some supportive, others threatening, all understanding that something fundamental had shifted in global politics. The young president from Burkina Faso had become the voice of a continental awakening that would reshape the 21st century. The audacious return of Africa to itself was no longer just a dream, it was now the official policy of nearly 1 billion people who had finally decided to control their own destiny.